The dollar was already in her hand before Birdie Wells understood what it meant. She stood on the platform of the Laramie train station, the Wyoming wind cutting through her coat like a blade of ice, and she stared at the single silver coin resting in her palm with the kind of bewilderment that comes just before grief. Around her, the steam from the locomotive billowed in great white clouds, obscuring the faces of the other passengers, turning the whole world into something ghostly and uncertain. Her trunk sat beside her feet. Her ticket was tucked inside her glove. She had exactly enough money to survive for 3 days in a town she had never visited, to find work she was not guaranteed to find, and to start a life she was not entirely sure she deserved. And then Clark Talbot had appeared out of the crowd like something the frontier itself had coughed up, rough and worn, and carrying a darkness behind his eyes that she recognized the way you recognize a song you have not heard since childhood. He had not said much. He had looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, taken in the torn hem of her skirt, the bruise still fading at the corner of her jaw, the desperate grip she had on her ticket like it was the last solid thing in the world, and he had pressed that dollar into her hand. "For whatever it is you are running from," he had said. His voice was low, almost gentle, completely at odds with the wanted poster she had seen tacked to the wall of the station master's office not 20 minutes before. Clark Talbot. Armed and dangerous. Reward of $200. There had been a sketch on the poster, a rough thing but recognizable enough. The sharp jaw, the line of a scar along the left cheekbone. The eyes that seemed to hold a secret even in a drawing. And now he was walking away from her, through the steam, his horse tied at the far end of the platform, and something in Birdie's chest cracked open in a way that made no sense at all because she did not know this man, had exchanged less than 40 words with him, and yet she had the overwhelming and terrifying feeling that he was walking away from the only honest thing either of them had touched in years. "Wait," she called. He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. She watched his shoulders rise and fall once slowly, the way a man breathes when he is deciding something enormous. Then he turned. And that was where it truly began. 3 weeks before that moment on the platform, Birdie Wells had been standing in the parlor of her father's house in Cheyenne, listening to the sound of a man she was supposed to marry counting out money onto a table. His name was Gerald Hatch, and he was 43 years old, and he had a way of looking at Birdie that made her feel like livestock being evaluated for purchase. The money he was counting was a debt settlement. Her father, Owen Wells, had borrowed from Hatch the previous spring to cover losses from a failed cattle venture, and now the debt had come due, and Owen Wells had offered the only asset he believed he still possessed: his daughter. Birdie was 24 years old. She had spent those years developing a sharp mind that her father considered a liability, a talent for figures that the local schoolteacher had called extraordinary, and a deep and genuine love for the open land of Wyoming that had never translated into any socially acceptable skill for a woman of her era and station. She could read a survey map. She could calculate acreage. She could tell you exactly what a piece of land was worth, and exactly how long it would take before a drought or a poor winter made it worth considerably less. None of these things mattered to Gerald Hatch, who wanted a wife who would manage his household, keep her opinions to herself, and produce children without complaint. "You will be comfortable," her father told her that evening after Hatch had gone. His voice was careful and apologetic in the way of a man who knows he is doing wrong but has decided the alternative is worse. "He has a fine house. You will not want for anything material." Birdie looked at her father for a long moment. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown and large, and they had a way of communicating precisely what she was thinking without her needing to say a word. Her mother had died of fever when Birdie was 9, and sometimes she thought that was the last time Owen Wells had made a decision based on love rather than fear. "I want for my own life," she said quietly. "That is the thing that is material to me." He had no answer for that. He rarely did. She left 4 days later, before the formal arrangements could be finalized, taking only what fit in her trunk: The small amount of cash she had saved from years of quietly doing the bookkeeping for a local merchant who paid her under the table, because paying a woman openly for skilled work was not something Cheyenne's business community had fully embraced in 1882. She told no one she was going. She bought a ticket to Laramie because it was the next train leaving, and she had been to Laramie once as a girl and remembered it being beautiful. The journey was approximately 50 miles by rail, short enough that it should have been without incident, long enough that by the time the train pulled into Laramie Station, the world had shifted in ways she had not anticipated. The trouble had started in the second hour of travel, when three men boarded at a small junction stop and immediately created the kind of atmosphere that made every experienced traveler in the car go very still. They were not overtly threatening. They did not draw weapons. But there was something calculated about the way they moved through the car, scanning faces, pausing at luggage racks, speaking to each other in voices too low to carry. Birdie had been raised in the West. She knew what armed men assessing a situation looked like, and these men were doing exactly that. The fourth man in the car, who seemed to notice, was sitting 2 rows ahead of her on the opposite side, and he noticed in a way that was notably different from the nervous passengers around him. He did not go still. He went quiet in a different way, a controlled, deliberate way, the way a hunting cat goes quiet. He shifted his position once, subtly, in a manner that Birdie recognized with a small shock as making room to draw a weapon if necessary. She had watched him for the rest of the journey with the kind of careful attention she usually reserved for survey maps and ledger books. He was perhaps 30 years old, dark brown hair under a battered hat, the scar along his jaw that she would later recognize from the wanted poster. He wore a coat that had seen better days but was clean, and his boots were good quality, worn in the way of someone who actually worked in them rather than someone performing the idea of frontier life. When the three men finally moved, selecting a target that turned out to be a frightened-looking older gentleman 3 rows back who was apparently carrying more cash than was wise, the man with the scar acted, not with violence, not initially. He stood up and said, in a voice that carried absolute authority, "Gentlemen, I think you have made a significant miscalculation in your choice of enterprise today." The 3 men turned. The oldest of them, a lean man with a pockmarked face, said, "This doesn't involve you, friend." "It involves the entire car," the man with the scar said. "And I am going to suggest, as strongly as I am capable of suggesting, that you put away whatever you are reaching for and sit down and enjoy the remainder of this journey in peace." The tension in the car was extraordinary. Birdie was not breathing. Nobody was breathing. The 3 men looked at each other. Then they looked at the man with the scar again, and something they saw in him, some quality of absolute stillness and certainty, made the oldest one make a small gesture. They moved back through the car and sat down, and they did not trouble anyone else for the remaining journey. The man with the scar sat back down. He did not look around to collect admiration or acknowledgement. He simply adjusted his hat and looked out the window, as though he had done nothing more remarkable than step out of someone's way on a sidewalk. At Laramie Station, as the passengers disembarked, Birdie found herself behind him in the narrow corridor of the car, and she said, without entirely planning to, "Thank you for what you did." He glanced back at her. The gray eyes were close up now, and she had been right. They did carry something deep and complicated in them, not the blankness of a man who had stopped caring, but the opposite, the carefully controlled expression of a man who cared about a great many things and had learned the hard way not to show it. "He was frightened," the man said simply, referring to the older gentleman. "Nobody ought to be robbed of their dignity on top of everything else." He stepped off the train. She followed a moment later. It was on the platform, as she was trying to gather herself and figure out what on earth she was going to do next, that she had seen the wanted poster on the wall of the station master's office. Clark Talbot. She had read it quickly, absorbing the details with the efficiency her mind naturally applied to information. Armed robbery. Suspected connection to the vicar's outfit, a loose gang of men who had been causing considerable trouble across southern Wyoming and northern Colorado for the past 2 years. $200 reward. She had looked from the poster to the man now standing 20 feet away from her, and he was looking at her too, and she had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that he knew exactly what she had just read. He walked toward her. She did not back away, which surprised her a little. "You read the poster," he said. "I did," she said, "and yet you are still standing there." "I am trying to decide what to make of you," she said honestly. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, the possibility of warmth. "That's a fair position," he said. He had looked at her then, truly looked at her, and she had seen his eyes take in the bruise at her jaw, the careful way she was gripping her ticket, the worn trunk at her feet, the expression of someone who had made a very large decision and was trying very hard to believe it was the right one. He reached into his coat. She braced herself without knowing why. But he brought out only a silver dollar, and he pressed it into her hand, and he said, "For whatever it is you are running from." "You do not know anything about me," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I know what running looks like." And then he was walking away, through the steam, toward his horse, and she called after him, and he stopped, and he turned, and the story truly began. "Where are you going?" She asked him when he had walked back to her, because it seemed like the most important question, though she could not have explained why. He studied her for a moment. "I have not entirely decided," he said, which was the most honest thing he could have told her, and she recognized honesty the way she recognized the bruise on her face by the particular quality of its weight. "I need work," she said. "Legitimate work. I am good with numbers. I can keep books for a hotel or a merchant or a ranch. I have experience." He said, "There is a boarding house on the main street run by a woman named Me Dunbar. She is fair. Tell her Clark sent you." "Clark," she said, testing the name. "Then, your name is on a wanted poster inside that building." "Yes," he said. "Are you going to tell me why?" He was quiet for a beat. "The poster is not the whole story," he said carefully. "But it is not entirely wrong either. I have done things I am not proud of. I am trying to decide if I am done doing them." It was, she thought, perhaps the most complicated answer she had ever heard a person give, and it was also, undeniably, an honest one. She had spent the past several years surrounded by men who lied with great confidence and ease. Her father, Gerald Hatch, the merchants of Cheyenne who paid her in cash because acknowledging her skills openly would have required acknowledging her as a person. Honesty, even complicated, troubled honesty, was remarkable to her. "I am Birdie Wells," she said. "Clark Talbot," he said, and the slight wry quality of it, acknowledging that she already knew, made something ease in her chest. "Are you going to be arrested if you stay in this town?" she asked. "Probably not today," he said, "but eventually." He met her eyes squarely. "I cannot promise you otherwise," she nodded slowly. She looked down at the dollar in her hand, and then back up at him, and she said something she had not planned to say, something that came from the part of her that had always operated on instinct and logic in equal measure. "What if you did not ride away today? What if you stayed long enough to figure out what you are deciding?" The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Clark Talbot looked at this woman he had met 20 minutes ago, who carried a bruise she had not explained, and a trunk with everything she owned, and the kind of eyes that saw clearly without cruelty, and he felt something shift in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. It was not a small thing. It was the opposite of a small thing. "Me Dunbar's boarding house," he said finally. "I know where she keeps the extra room." Me Dunbar was exactly what Wyoming produced when it combined frontier practicality with genuine warmth. A woman of about 55 with iron-gray hair and hands that could have belonged to a carpenter, steady and capable and unmistakably her own. She took one look at Birdie's bruise and her carefully composed expression and her good quality but well-worn clothing and said, "You will have the room at the end of the hall. Breakfast is at 7. I will not ask what you are running from unless you want to tell me." "Thank you," Birdie said, and meant it at a depth she had not expected. Clark sent you, me said. It was not a question. She said the name with the tone of someone who had complex feelings about a person and had mostly made peace with them. He is a complicated man. Yes, Birdie agreed. I noticed. He has a good heart, me said, in the precise tone of a woman hedging her assessment. The problem with a good heart is that it does not automatically produce good judgment. Come in. I will show you the room. Clark took the other available room that night, not out of any plan, simply because he had told himself he would figure out his next move in the morning. And the morning came, and he was still there. He ate breakfast at Me's table with Birdie Wells across from him, and found that she had an opinion on nearly everything, and expressed it with a directness that he found startling and then immediately refreshing. Most women in 1882 Wyoming practiced a certain kind of social performance around men they did not know, a careful management of impression. Birdie did not do this, or if she had ever learned to do it, she had clearly abandoned the practice. She told me she was looking for bookkeeping work. Me said she knew a merchant on the second block who had been trying to manage his own ledgers for 2 years and was doing it badly. Birdie asked if she could see a sample of his work. Me sent a message that morning. By afternoon, Birdie had walked through the merchant's shop, looked at his ledgers for approximately 6 minutes, explained to him in clear and specific terms exactly where he had gone wrong, and why he was accidentally undercounting his supply costs by nearly 18%, and walked out with a job starting the following week. Clark had been waiting outside. He had told himself he was just taking the air. He was aware this was not entirely true. You got it, he said, reading her expression. I got it, she confirmed. There was a glow to her that was not quite happiness exactly. It was more like something that had been compressed for a long time finally having room to expand. He was surprised. I think he expected someone to come in and nod politely at the ledgers and not actually understand them. He did not know what he was getting, Clark said. She looked at him sideways as they walked. What did you do before whatever is on that poster? He was quiet for a moment, measuring. I ranched, he said. My family had land in Colorado. That was a long time ago. What happened to it? Lost it, he said simply. There is a long version of that story and a short one. The short version is that I made choices when I was 22 that I would not make now, and the consequences of those choices cascaded in ways I did not anticipate. And by the time I was 24, I had no land, no family left to speak of, and a significant debt to men who were not interested in being repaid with patience. Birdie listened with the focused attention she gave to everything. And the vicar's outfit? She asked. He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him without flinching. I rode with them for about a year, he said, 2 years ago. I want to be clear with you about what that means. I participated in things during that year that I cannot undo. I'm not going to tell you they were harmless or justify them. I helped rob a stage and 2 supply wagons. Nobody was killed. I would have walked away if it had gone any other direction, but I am not going to tell you those things did not happen because they did. The honesty of it landed heavily between them. She did not look away. Why did you leave? She asked. Because I looked at the men I was riding with, and I saw what I was going to be in 10 years if I kept going, he said. And I did not want to be that. I have been trying to figure out how to be something else ever since, which is complicated when your name is on a wanted poster in 4 territories. Birdie was quiet for a long moment. They had stopped near the edge of the main street, and the afternoon light of Wyoming in late autumn was the kind of light that makes everything look simultaneously sharp and golden, and she was standing in it looking at him with an expression he could not quite categorize. I appreciate that you told me the truth, she said finally. Most people in your position would have offered a version of it. I noticed that you are the kind of person who would see through a version of it, he said. It seemed inefficient. The corner of her mouth turned up. It was the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face in a way that hit him somewhere in the chest with surprising force. What are your plans? She asked. Honestly, I have been considering turning myself in to a territorial marshal I know in Denver who has indicated, informally, that there may be options for men willing to cooperate and make some form of restitution. I wrote up here because I wanted to think, and because I knew me would not ask too many questions. Cooperate meaning testify against the vicar's outfit, meaning give information that helps dismantle them, yes. Which would make me a target of several dangerous men, hence the uncertainty about the plan. But it would clear your name, Birdie said, potentially, if the marshal is as good as his word, if I survive long enough to see the arrangement through. He said it without self-pity, simply as a statement of the territory he was navigating. She looked at him for a long moment. Well, she said, it seems like we have both arrived at a crossroads at roughly the same time. It seems that way, he agreed. I find crossroads easier to navigate when I can think them through with someone else, she said, if you are amenable to company. It was, he thought, both the most practical and the most terrifying invitation he had received in years. I am amenable, he said. The days that followed were not dramatic in the way of the life Clark Talbot had been living. They were something quieter and more dangerous than drama. They were ordinary. He stayed at me's boarding house. He found small work, the kind that kept his hands busy and his profile low, repairing fences for a rancher outside town, hauling lumber for a building going up on the north end of Laramie. He was good with his hands, always had been, and there was something deeply satisfying about working with wood and iron for honest wages after 2 years of the alternative. Birdie began her work at the merchant's shop and was immediately indispensable in the way that people with genuine skill always are once they have the space to apply it. Within a week, the merchant, a stout man named Fenwick, had introduced her to 2 of his business associates who also needed bookkeeping help, and she was managing 3 sets of ledgers and making more per week than she had made per month in Cheyenne. They ate most evenings at me's table, the 4 of them including me's occasional boarder, an elderly surveyor named Amos who was mostly deaf and had strong opinions about the quality of coffee, and they talked about the town and the news coming down from Cheyenne and the territory. And sometimes they argued about things like land rights and railroad policy, and the treatment of the Arapaho and Shoshone peoples who had been progressively dispossessed of the land that was now being built upon. A subject on which both Birdie and Clark had views that sometimes aligned and sometimes diverged productively. It was in those arguments that something real began to grow between them. Not the careful courtship performance that the era prescribed, where a man presented himself favorably, and a woman assessed whether his presentation matched his substance, but something more direct and genuine, a meeting of 2 people who had both been through enough to dispense with pretense. One evening, about 10 days after they had met, they were walking back from the edge of town where they had gone to watch the last of the sunset over the Laramie Range, because Wyoming sunsets were one of the things Birdie had remembered from her childhood visit and had not been disappointed by on return. The sky was doing something extraordinary, deep violet streaking into burnt orange, and they were walking slowly because neither of them particularly wanted to stop watching it. "Tell me about when you were a girl," he said. It was the first time he had asked her about her past directly. She considered the question with the thoughtfulness she brought to everything. "My mother was alive," she said. "That is the central fact of that time. When she was there, the house was different. She was the kind of woman who made space for things, for questions and disagreement and laughter. My father was not a cruel man when she was alive. He was just, I suppose, more himself. And when she died, he became afraid," she said. "Fear changes people. He made smaller and smaller choices, trying to minimize risk, and somehow the choices themselves became the biggest risk of all." She paused. "I am not telling you he is a villain. He is not. He is a frightened man who ran out of imagination." "And Gerald Hatch," Clark said carefully. It was the first time he had said the name, though she had told him about Hatch several days earlier in a matter-of-fact way that had nonetheless made something cold and furious move through him. "Gerald Hatch is a man who has never once been required to consider that other people have inner lives," she said crisply. He is not interesting enough to be a villain. He is simply someone who believes the world exists for his convenience. Did he hit you? Clark asked. His voice was very quiet and very controlled. She glanced at him. He did not. That was my father, not in cruelty, but in a kind of panicked desperation when I told him I would not marry Hatch. He immediately regretted it. It does not particularly matter. I was leaving either way. Clark was quiet for a moment, processing this. What will you do about your father? Eventually, she was quiet for a long moment. I do not know. I am angry enough right now that I cannot think about it clearly. I think someday I will write to him. I do not think I can be in the same room with him for some time. That seems reasonable, he said. She looked at him. What about you? Do you have family? A sister, he said, and the word carried a weight she recognized as complicated love. In Denver. Her name is Ruth. She married a printer. They have 2 boys. I have not seen them in 3 years because I did not want to bring trouble to their door. He paused. That is the thing nobody tells you about the choices you make when you are young and reckless. The cost is not just paid by you, it spreads. They had stopped walking without realizing it, standing at the edge of the last light from the sunset, and the distance between them was small, and Birdie was looking at him with an expression that had moved beyond careful assessment into something warmer and less guarded, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has stopped pretending he is not looking. Clark, she said. Birdie, he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way anyone had ever said it, like it was something worth saying carefully. I think, she said slowly, that you should write to that marshal in Denver. It was not what he had expected her to say, and it startled a small sound out of him that was almost a laugh. That is your response to this moment. It is, she said, and now she was smiling, the real smile that transformed her face. Because if you are going to figure out what you are deciding about your future, you cannot do it in permanent suspension. And I think you have been in suspension for 2 years because the first move is the frightening one. He looked at her for a long time. You are remarkable, he said quietly. I have been told I am inconvenient, she said. Those are not mutually exclusive, he said. The first time he touched her was 2 days later, and it was not dramatic in the way of stories. It was quiet and specific. She had come in from work one evening looking tired in a way that was different from her usual energy, and when me asked if she was all right, she had said yes and clearly meant no. And after dinner, she had gone out to sit on the back step of the boarding house in the cold evening air. Clark had come out a few minutes later with 2 cups of coffee, which me kept on the stove all evening, and he had sat down beside her on the step without asking permission and handed her a cup. She had taken it without looking at him, and for a while they sat in silence with the cold air around them and the distant sound of the town settling into its evening rhythms. What happened? He asked eventually. I had a letter today, she said. From Cheyenne, my father. He has found out where I am. What does he say? He is sorry, she said, and her voice was entirely level. He says he is sorry and that he made a mistake and that he loves me. He says Hatch has found another arrangement and the debt is settled by another means, and that I could come home. She paused. He also says that Laramie is no place for a young woman alone, and that he worries about my circumstances. What will you tell him? I have not decided, she said. She turned the coffee cup slowly in her hands. The thing is, he probably is sorry, and he probably does love me in the way that he understands love. And Laramie is the first place in years where I have felt like I could breathe. She stopped. I am not going home. I am certain of that. I'm just working out how I feel about the other parts. He did not offer advice. He did not try to fix the thing, which she would later tell him was the most important thing he could have done. He simply sat beside her in the cold, and after a little while he shifted slightly so that their shoulders were touching, and she did not move away, and they sat like that in the quiet evening while Wyoming settled around them. She turned her head and looked at him, and he was already looking at her, and she said very quietly, I am glad you did not ride away at the station. So am I, he said, with a simplicity that carried everything. He wrote the letter to the marshal in Denver 3 days later. He wrote it at me's kitchen table on a Sunday morning while the house was quiet, and when it was done, He read it through once, and then he folded it and sealed it and walked it to the post office before he could reconsider. It was addressed to Marshal Henry Crow of the Denver office, and it laid out in careful and complete terms what Clark Talbot knew about the Vickers outfit, their roots, their contacts, their primary operations, and what he was prepared to offer in exchange for a formal amnesty arrangement. He came back to Mies and found Birdie in the parlor with a ledger, and he told her what he had done. She put down the ledger. She looked at him with those dark eyes that saw everything clearly. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I have stepped off a very high cliff," he said, "and I am not entirely sure yet whether I have wings." "You have wings," she said simply. He shook his head slowly, a small helpless smile crossing his face. "You say things like they are settled facts." "When I am certain, yes," she said. The reply from Marshal Crow came 2 weeks later, which was faster than Clark had expected, and it was both promising and complicated, which was not surprising. Crow wrote that he was very interested in the information Talbot possessed, that there was indeed a framework for amnesty available through the territorial court for individuals cooperating with federal investigations, but that Clark would need to come to Denver in person to sign formal affidavits and undergo a review process that could take several weeks. He would be required to remain available and under informal custody during this time, which meant staying in Denver, but he would not be in a cell provided nothing unexpected emerged in the review. Clark read the letter 3 times. Then he went and found Birdie, who read it once and said, "When do you need to leave?" "Crow suggests as soon as possible," Clark said. "Before the Vickers outfit gets wind of it, if they find out I have made contact, the timeline becomes dangerous." She was quiet. He could see her processing it, weighing it, and he could also see something else in her expression, something she was working to keep composed. "How long would you be in Denver?" she asked. "Weeks, possibly longer. I do not know with certainty." She nodded. She set the letter down on the table between them and looked at it rather than at him, and then she looked at him. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have developed feelings for you that are significant enough that I want to say that clearly before you go, so there is no ambiguity." The directness of it, which was so entirely her, hit him with a force that momentarily removed his capacity for words. He had known it, had felt the warmth of it building between them over these weeks, but hearing her say it in her clear, precise way was different from knowing it. "Birdie," he said. "I am not asking you for a promise," she said quickly. "I understand that your situation is uncertain and that the road ahead is complicated and that Denver may change things in ways neither of us can predict. I just did not want you to leave without knowing." He crossed the small distance between them. He took her hands in his, and her hands were warm and real and slightly ink-stained from the ledgers, and he held them and looked at her and said, "I have feelings for you that are more than significant. You are the most remarkable person I have been in a room within longer than I can calculate. And I am going to Denver to try to become someone worthy of the life that is sitting in this room with me, and I am coming back." The tears that appeared in her eyes were not weakness. He knew that. They were the release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. "You had better," she said, and her voice was entirely steady even with the tears. He kissed her then, for the first time, soft and careful, and full of every complicated and honest thing that had passed between them over the past weeks. And she kissed him back with the same quality of absolute honesty that she brought to everything else. And when it ended, they stood with their foreheads together for a moment in the quiet parlor while me diplomatically banged around in the kitchen, to indicate that she knew what was happening and approved of it but was giving them privacy. He left the next morning. The goodbye at the door of me's boarding house was not long, because long goodbyes were not their way. He held her face in his hands and looked at her like he was memorizing her, which he was, and she put her hand flat against his chest over his heart, as though taking stock of something she intended to find again. "Come back honest," she said. "That is the plan," he said. He rode south toward Denver with the Wyoming plains opening around him, and the mountains in the distance, and a feeling in his chest that was entirely new, the feeling of riding towards something instead of away from it. Denver in the winter of 1882 was a city in vigorous motion, barely 15 years past its gold rush origins, and now a major hub of commerce and territorial governance, with electric lights just beginning to appear in its wealthier establishments, and the sense of a place that was becoming something, though it had not entirely decided what. Marshal Henry Crow's office was on the second floor of a building near the federal courthouse, and when Clark arrived and introduced himself, Crow turned out to be a compact man in his early 50s, with a careful, intelligent face, and the manner of someone who had dealt with complicated situations for so long that very little surprised him. "You took longer than I expected," Crow said, looking at Clark across a desk cluttered with files and telegraph messages. "I had something to work out first," Clark said. Crow studied him. "Are you sure you want to do this? Because once you sign these affidavits, there is no going back. The Vickers outfit will know eventually. They have ears." "I am sure," Clark said, and he was. He had arrived at Shore somewhere on the road south, somewhere in the space between what he had been and what he intended to be, and the sureness had a quality of bedrock about it that he recognized as real. The process was, as Crow had warned, neither fast nor comfortable. There were days of formal depositions, Clark sitting across from Crow and a territorial attorney named Bassett and giving his account of his time with the Vickers outfit in exhaustive, specific detail. Names, dates, routes, the locations of caches, the identities of corrupt officials who had looked the other way. It was not a short testimony. It was the accounting of an entire year of his life, and the process of rendering it into formal record was both draining and, in a way he had not expected, clarifying. As though the act of saying it all clearly and completely, without minimizing or justifying, was its own form of unburdening. He wrote to Birdie twice a week. She wrote back. Her letters were exactly what he would have predicted, direct and warm and full of things that were happening in Laramie. The ongoing drama of Fenwick's supply chain, Me's running battle with a neighbor over a disputed fence line, the first significant snowfall of the winter, Amos the surveyor's departure for Arizona. She described things precisely, in a way that made him see them, and she asked him specific questions about Denver and the process and how he was managing. And when he wrote back, he found he was telling her things he had not told anyone, the texture of the past 2 years, the specific moment he had known he needed to leave the Vickers outfit, the thing that still kept him awake at night, which was not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. The knowledge that the victims of those robberies had not deserved what happened to them and that no arrangement with a marshal changed that. She wrote back, "Restitution is not only legal, it is also how you move through the world from here. You know this. I think you have always known this." He read that letter 4 times. The amnesty arrangement was formalized at the end of the 4th week, with conditions. Clark was required to make himself available for the subsequent federal prosecution of the Vickers outfit members, which would likely take another year to fully develop, and he was prohibited from leaving Colorado or Wyoming territory without notifying Crow's office. He was not, however, charged with any crime. His cooperation, combined with the quality and extent of his information, had been deemed sufficient. Crow shook his hand with the air of a man who had seen worse and was guardedly satisfied with the outcome. "You are not entirely free," Crow told him, "but you are as close to it as this office can offer you. Do not waste it." "I have no intention of wasting it," Clark said. He went first to the printer's shop on Blake Street, where his brother-in-law ran his business, and he stood in the doorway and waited while the man inside finished with a customer and turned around, and then he said, "James." James Talbot by marriage looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Ruth is going to cry." "Probably," Clark agreed. Ruth did cry briefly and fiercely, and then she wiped her eyes and held him at arm's length and examined him with the merciless affection of a sister and said, "You look better than you did 3 years ago. "There is something different about you." "There is," he agreed. "Tell me," she said. "Her name is Birdie Wells," he said. Ruth's expression moved through several registers very quickly and landed on something that was entirely warm. "Tell me everything," she said. He stayed 2 nights in Denver with Ruth and James and his nephews, who were 8 and 6, and regarded their uncle with the pure, uncomplicated enthusiasm of small children who had been told they had an uncle in a general category of adventure. And then he rode north toward Laramie with the sense of something aligning, something falling into the place it had always been going toward if he had only been moving in the right direction. He arrived back in Laramie on a Tuesday afternoon in January, the air cold and bright with the specific clarity of high plains winter, and he rode to Me's boarding house and tied his horse and knocked on the door. Me opened it and looked at him with the expression of someone who had been expecting this and had feelings about it that were mostly positive. "She is at Fenwick's," Me said. "She will be back by 5. "I will wait," he said. He had been sitting in the parlor for approximately 20 minutes, hat in his hands, when he heard the front door open and her footsteps in the hall, and she appeared in the parlor doorway, and she stopped when she saw him. She looked at him. She took in the whole of him the way she always did, completely and specifically. Then she said, "Your name is no longer on a wanted poster." "Correct," he said. She crossed the room. She did not run, that was not her way, but she walked with a directness and purpose that was entirely characteristic. And when she reached him, he had already stood up, and she put her hands on his face and looked at him very carefully for a moment, and then she said, "Hello, Clark Talbot." "Hello, Birdie Wells," he said. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and Me in the kitchen once again performed the small domestic symphony of someone deliberately making enough noise to maintain everyone's dignity. The weeks that followed were, if anything, better than the weeks before his departure, because they were lived with something settled between them, something declared and acknowledged, and the daily life of it was exactly what he had imagined from Me's parlor, and better than he had imagined from the road to Denver. They were together in the easiest and also the most deliberate sense of the word. 2 people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and were discovering daily that the choice held up under the weight of ordinary life. He found steadier work in those months, taking a position at a small ranch outside Laramie owned by a man named August Priest, who raised horses and needed someone with a genuine understanding of the animals and the land. Clark had that understanding in his bones from his years in Colorado, and Priest, who was a taciturn and fair man of about 60, recognized it immediately and paid him accordingly. The work was honest and physical and satisfying, in a way that the past 2 years had not been, and he came home in the evenings to Me's table and Birdie's conversation, and the particular quality of rightness that he was slowly learning to accept without waiting for it to be taken from him. Birdie, for her part, was building something in Laramie that she had never had in Cheyenne, a life shaped entirely by her own choices. She had expanded her bookkeeping clients to 6 businesses by March and was being paid well for all of them. She had developed a friendship with a woman named Clara Osgood who taught at the local school and was possessed of a dry wit and a strong set of opinions about women's education that aligned closely with Birdie's own. She was learning, slowly and with some resistance from the more resistant parts of herself, to live without the low-grade vigilance that had been her default state for most of her adult life in her father's house. She wrote to her father in February. It was not a long letter. It acknowledged his letter, accepted his apology without fully resolving it, told him she was well and employed and living in circumstances she had chosen, and told him she would write again when she had more to say. She did not tell him about Clark, not yet. That was a conversation for a later time, when she had decided what she wanted it to be. Her father wrote back within the week, a shorter letter than his first, careful and quiet in a way that suggested he understood he was on uncertain ground, and was trying to navigate it with more care than he had previously applied. She read it twice, and felt the complex tangle of love and anger begin to shift, not dissolve, but shift, moving toward something more workable. Clark's involvement in the federal case against the Vickers outfit became more active in the spring, when several of the outfit's members were apprehended in Colorado, and Marshal Crowe requested Clark's formal testimony at preliminary hearings in Denver. He made 2 trips south for this purpose, each time gone for several days, and each time the going and returning had the quality of a small practice in trust, both of them trusting that the other would be there on the return, and both of them being right. The trial itself took place over the summer of 1883, and it was significant enough that it attracted attention from the Cheyenne papers and even a correspondent from back east. Clark's testimony was damning and specific, and according to Crowe's subsequent letter to him, instrumental in securing convictions on the major charges. Several members of the outfit received substantial prison sentences. The leader, a man named Ellis Vickers, received life. The danger that had been a constant background presence throughout the winter and spring dissipated with the convictions. Not entirely. Men like this always had associates and grudges, but substantially. Crowe wrote that the federal office considered the primary threat neutralized and that Clark's obligations under the amnesty arrangement were now fully discharged. Clark read this letter at Me's kitchen table on a July morning with Birdie sitting across from him drinking coffee, and he set it down and looked at her. "It is done," he said. She looked at him. She read the quality of the thing in his face. "Completely done, he said. She set down her coffee cup. She looked at him for a moment with the precise, clear gaze that he had first seen at Laramie Station a year ago, and had come to understand as the most honest thing he had ever been looked at with. "Then I have a question for you," she said. "All right," he said. "I have been thinking," she said, in the tone she used for things she had thought about a great deal and was ready to commit to about land. "There is a parcel east of Laramie, about 300 acres, that has come available. I have seen the survey maps. The water situation is good, which is the important thing, and the soil in the lower sections would support a kitchen garden and eventually some crops. The upper sections are good grazing land." He studied her. "You have been looking at land," he said slowly. "I have," she said. "I have also been calculating. My savings over the past year and a half, combined with what you have put aside from preces, are sufficient for a deposit on a property of this size, provided we could manage the rest through the first few years of operation." "Birdie," he said. "I am getting to the question," she said. "I know," he said, and he was smiling now genuinely, the full smile that she had noticed rarely enough to value highly. "I just wanted to say your name." She paused, and the corners of her eyes softened, and she said, "Will you look at the land with me, Clark? And if you think it is right, will you build something there with me, properly, as my husband?" The silence that followed was the kind that does not need to be long. "Yes," he said, "to all 3 parts of that question, and I want you to know that the answer was arrived at clearly and completely, with no reservations, none, and with more gratitude than I know how to express in a sentence." "Then express it over time," she said simply. "That is exactly what I intend," he said. He was across the table before she had finished the sentence, and she was standing, and he held her like something he was not going to let go of, and she held him back with the same quality of absolute intention, and Me appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at them, made a small satisfied sound, and went back to her business. They looked at the land the following week, riding out east of town on a morning that was warm and clear and smelled of grass and the distant suggestion of rain. 320 acres, to be precise, bounded on the north by a creek that ran reliably according to the previous owner's records, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds by a rise of land to the northwest, with a view south and east that went on for what felt like forever in the open Wyoming way. Birdie stood in the middle of the upper field and turned in a slow circle, looking at all of it, and Clark watched her and knew what she was doing. The same thing he had done when he first seen good land as a boy, was measuring it not just with your eyes but with something deeper, asking it if it was the kind of place that would hold a life. "Yes," she said finally, not to him but to the land, and then she turned to him and said it again. "Yes." They filed the paperwork the following week. The property was registered in both their names, which the land office registrar handled with very slightly raised eyebrows and no comment, because it was unusual but not impossible, and Birdie's expression as she signed her name next to Clark's on the deed was the expression of someone planting a flag in territory they have won. They were married in October of 1883 in Me Dunbar's parlor, because the parlor was where they had met properly, and it seemed right, in a ceremony performed by the local Methodist minister, a youngish man named Whitfield who was considerably warmer and more practical than the stereotype of his profession. Me cried. Me maintained afterward that she had not cried but had something in both eyes simultaneously. Ruth and James came from Denver with the boys, and Ruth embraced Birdie with the directness of someone who had already decided to love her and was simply expressing it formally, and the boys decided they approved of their aunt because she answered their questions about mathematics with actual answers rather than condescension. Birdie's father was invited. He came. He was thinner than she remembered and older-looking, and he shook Clark's hand with a grip that communicated the complex mixture of guilt and relief of a man who understood he had nearly made a catastrophic mistake and was grateful beyond his power to express that it had not come to pass. He and Birdie had one private conversation in Me's kitchen that lasted about 20 minutes and that nobody else heard, and when they came back out, Birdie's eyes were slightly red and her father's were considerably red, and she went and stood next to Clark and took his hand, and it was clear that something had moved, not resolved entirely. These things do not resolve entirely, but moved in a direction that was healthier and more livable than the place it had been before. They moved into the house on the land in late October. The existing structure was a solid but basic two-room cabin that the previous owner had built with good materials if not much imagination, and they spent the first winter making it habitable and planning what it would eventually become, drawing plans on paper at the kitchen table in the evenings with the fire going and the Wyoming wind doing its things outside. And these evenings were some of the most purely happy times either of them had experienced. The specific happiness of building something together from nothing, of looking at a blank space and deciding together what to put in it. Clark worked the land through that first winter and into the spring, learning its specific temperament the way you learn any new thing, with patience and attention and a willingness to be surprised. He bought 4 horses from Preece, good animals, and found that he had more confidence with them than he had remembered having, as though the skills from his Colorado years had been waiting in storage and were now available again. He hired a hand for the spring planting, a quiet young Shoshone man named Thomas Broken Arrow, who had grown up in the territory and knew its land in ways that no settler could fully replicate, and who worked with a quality of steady expertise that Clark respected enormously and paid accordingly, which was not universal practice among ranchers of the era and which Thomas noticed. Birdie kept her bookkeeping work for the first year, riding into Laramie 3 days a week to work her accounts, because the land would not turn a profit in its first year, and they needed the income, and she had no intention of giving up something she was good at and valued merely because she was now married, which was a position that Clark supported without qualification. Partly because it was obviously right, and partly because the alternative of suggesting otherwise to Birdie was something he had enough self-preservation instinct to recognize as inadvisable. She discovered she was expecting their first child in the spring of 1884, on a morning when the creek was running high from snowmelt, and the first of the year's calves had just been born, and she told Clark that evening by simply saying his name in a certain tone, and he looked up from the account books he had taken over managing that evening because she had a headache, and he read her face in the way he had learned to read it over the past year and a half, completely and specifically. And he was very still for a moment, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," she said. "I just wanted to say it clearly. We are going to have a child." He came to her immediately, crossing the small kitchen, and held her face in his hands the way he had at the door of Me's boarding house on the day he came back from Denver, looking at her with that particular quality of absolute attention that was his equivalent of every declaration he had ever made. "I love you," he said, which he had said many times by now, but which always came out with the same quality of something deeply meant. "I am the luckiest man in Wyoming territory." "You are luckier than you were," she said, which was a Birdie Wells distinction, "but you also did the work to arrive at this position." "We both did," he said. The child was a boy, born in November of 1884 on a cold, bright day that felt like an announcement, and they named him Owen James Talbot. Owen for Birdie's father, which was a deliberate act of grace, and James for Clark's brother-in-law, which delighted Ruth when she heard it. He was a vigorous child with Clark's gray eyes and Birdie's dark hair, and a personality that announced itself within the first days of his life as formidably opinionated, which Birdie said was clearly her contribution, and Clark said was clearly both of theirs. Owen Wells came to see his grandson the following spring, making the journey from Cheyenne with more care and humility than he had previously applied to much of anything. And he held the boy with the expression of a man who has been offered something he was not sure he deserved and is trying to be worthy of it. And Birdie watched her father hold her son and felt something in her chest that was not forgiveness exactly. She was too honest for that word, but was something in its neighborhood. Something that made continued contact possible and even occasionally welcome. The ranch grew. Not spectacularly, not in the way of the great cattle operations of the era, but steadily and well, the way things grow when they are properly tended by people who understand what they are doing and are willing to learn what they do not know yet. They added to the herd in 1885, took on a second hand, and Birdie designed an expansion to the house that Clark and Thomas and the new hand, a steady man named Eli Marsh, built over the summer, adding 2 proper bedrooms and a larger kitchen, and a parlor with windows on the south wall that let in the afternoon light in a way that Birdie had specified precisely, because she understood light the way she understood ledger books, as something to be managed thoughtfully. Their second child was a girl, born in the autumn of 1886, and they named her Ruth Eleanor Talbot, for Clark's sister first and Birdie's mother second, which made 2 women in Denver and a quiet afternoon grave in Cheyenne, both part of the same name in a way that felt like the right kind of continuity. Ruth, when she heard, wrote the most emotional letter she had ever sent in her life, which James gently intercepted and rewrote for clarity before sending, though Ruth made him include her original version as well. The years moved in the way of good years, which is to say they were full and various, and did not always go as planned and were, on balance, good. There were difficult winters and a summer drought that cost them a portion of the herd, and required a recalculation of the finances that Birdie managed with the focused competence that she brought to all crises. There were the ordinary and extraordinary challenges of raising children on the frontier, Owen's broken arm from a fall off a fence at age 4, and his subsequent utter indifference to this injury that Birdie found both terrifying and characteristic. Ruth Eleanor's early gift for language that produced a stream of commentary from the age of 2 that nobody in the family could entirely keep up with. Clark had a horse go lame on him during the winter of 1887 in a way that left him briefly out of commission, spending 3 days in bed with a wrenched back that he had gotten trying to save the animal. And Birdie managed the ranch during those 3 days with Thomas's help, and a calmness that Clark, from his forced horizontal position, found simultaneously admirable and mildly infuriating in the way of a capable person, temporarily unable to be capable. "You are an excellent manager of this ranch," he told her on the second day. "I know," she said, handing him a cup of the willow bark tea that she had learned from me was good for pain. "I am saying I appreciate it." "I know that too," she said, and sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at him with the clear dark eyes, and he reached out and took her hand. "How is the back?" "Better than yesterday," he said. "Worse than I am telling you," she smiled. "I know that as well," he laughed, which hurt slightly. "Have you ever not known something?" "Frequently," she said. "I just do not advertise it." He was riding again by the fourth day, which was perhaps one day earlier than wisdom advised, but which he managed without incident, and which Birdie noted without comment because she had learned, over the years of their marriage, the specific ways in which Clark Talbot would push himself and the specific ways in which he would not, and she had calibrated her responses accordingly. Me Dunbar died in the spring of 1888, peacefully and at home, at the age of 61, having lived exactly as she had intended to for the whole of her adult life. Birdie went into Laramie for the service and stood at the graveside with a grief that was uncomplicated and real, the straightforward grief of losing someone who had been unfailingly kind at a moment when kindness was in short supply. And afterward she went to what had been Me's boarding house and sat in the parlor where she and Clark had had their first real conversations, and she held the memory of it carefully for a while before she drove the buggy home. She told Clark about it that evening, and he listened with the quality of attention that was still, after 5 years, one of the things she loved most about him, the sense that when he was listening to you, he was entirely there. "She was a good woman," he said. "She was," Birdie agreed. "She believed in second chances. She demonstrated it without making a performance of it." "Like someone else I know," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I did not give you a second chance," she said. "I gave you a first one. The second chances are the ones you gave yourself." He took her hand across the table. She turned her palm up and held his. Their third child arrived in 1889, another boy, and they named him Henry, which was Birdie's choice, for Marshal Henry Crowe, who had made good on his word and handled a difficult situation with integrity, and who had written a genuine letter of congratulations when the amnesty was finalized that Clark had kept in a box in the bedroom, because it was, in its way, a document of the turning point. Henry was, from the beginning, his father's child in temperament, quiet and observant and enormously competent with animals in a way that seemed to be native rather than taught, and Clark took particular pleasure in the mornings when Henry, at age 3, would appear at the barn door and station himself with absolute seriousness beside his father during the morning chores, a tiny version of the same watchful stillness that Clark had always carried. Owen, at 7, was already showing the marks of Birdie's intelligence applied to the outdoor world, the kind of boy who wanted to know the why of everything and who asked questions in a rapid, connected sequence that moved from the original subject outward in ways that sometimes required his parents to sit down together and think carefully before answering. Ruth Aliner, at 5, was the social engine of the family, the child who organized and negotiated and expressed opinions on all subjects with a verbal fluency that made visitors blink and family members laugh. In the summer of 1890, Clark received a letter from James in Denver that contained news he had been half expecting for years. Ruth was unwell, not dangerously at this point but persistently, a chest ailment that the Denver physicians were monitoring carefully. James wrote with the particular restrained worry of a man trying not to alarm while clearly being alarmed, and Clark read the letter and handed it to Birdie and said, "I want to go to Denver." "Of course," she said immediately. "We will all go." "You do not have to. I want the children to know their aunt," Birdie said, "and I want to see her myself. And besides, Eli can manage the ranch for a week. Thomas has done it before, and you are not going to Denver alone when your sister needs you." He looked at her. He did not argue, because she was right on every count, and also because he had long ago learned that arguing with Birdie Wells Talbot on a matter she had already decided was an endeavor with a predictable outcome. They made the journey south in July, the whole family in the wagon with sufficient provisions for the trip, Owen asking questions about everything they passed, Ruth Aliner providing commentary, Henry sleeping on Birdie's lap for most of the first day with the contentment of a child who trusted the world completely. Clark drove and watched the road south and felt the particular weight of the landscape he had crossed alone, desperate and uncertain, 8 years ago, now crossed in the opposite direction with everything he had not known to hope for beside him. Ruth was thinner than her last visit, but her warmth was entirely intact, and she embraced her brother at the door of the house on Blake Street and then stepped back and looked at the 3 children and said, in the voice of a woman who knows exactly what she is looking at, "Oh, Clark." "I know," he said. "You have done well," she said, and she was not only talking about the children. The week in Denver was good medicine for everyone. Ruth rallied visibly in the presence of the family, and the Denver physicians, when Clark spoke to them, were cautiously encouraging about her long-term prognosis, provided she managed her winters carefully. James and Clark had long conversations in the evenings after the children were in bed, conversations that covered the landscape of their shared history, and arrived at a place that felt like genuine, uncomplicated brotherhood. Birdie spent a morning with Marshall Crowe, which she had requested, and which Clark had arranged with some curiosity about her intentions. She came back from it looking satisfied in the specific way she looked when she had accomplished something important. "What did you say to him?" Clark asked. "I thanked him," she said, "properly, and I told him what came of it. He deserved to know." Clark was quiet for a moment. "He told you it was unnecessary, I imagine." "He did," she said. "I told him it was necessary to me, and that distinction was not his to make." Crowe, she had reported, had listened to her account of the ranch and the children and the life they had built, and had said, with the laconic satisfaction of a man who rarely allowed himself any, "That is a good outcome, Mrs. Talbot." They came home to Wyoming in the last days of July, the landscape rolling out around them as familiar and beloved as anything Clark had ever known, and when the ranch came into view on the late afternoon of the 3rd day, the house with Birdie's south-facing parlor windows catching the setting sun and the horses moving in the paddock and the creek visible as a gleam to the north, Owen said, "There it is," with a proprietary satisfaction that was exactly right. "There it is," Clark agreed. In the years that followed, the ranch became exactly what Birdie had seen in the survey maps and the good water and the long view south and east. A real place, a going concern, a home with history accumulating in it. The children grew in the way of children raised with space and love and parents who took them seriously, developing into people with the particular self-possession of those who have been treated from the beginning as people rather than objects of management. Owen, at 12, was already keeping his own set of ledger books for the ranch with his mother's instruction and his father's quiet pride, accurate to the cent, and annotated with observations about market trends that showed an understanding beyond his years. Ruth Eleanor was teaching herself to read anything she could get her hands on, and Birdie had arranged a correspondence with Clara Osgood, now Clara Osgood Marsh and teaching in a larger school, who sent books and occasionally materials that the Laramie school did not have, because Ruth Eleanor's appetite for learning was outrunning what was locally available. Henry, at 6, was his father in miniature in all the ways that mattered, and the relationship between them had the quality of 2 people who communicated significantly without many words. Clark, at 39, was the man he had decided to be. He knew this not with pride exactly, but with a settled certainty that was entirely different from the suspended uncertainty of his past. The wanted poster was gone from the Laramie station, had been removed years ago when the amnesty was formalized, and he passed through that station occasionally now on business and felt the absence of it as a clean and simple thing. He was a rancher, a husband, a father. A man in good standing with his community and his own conscience. These were not small things. He knew they were not small things. Birdie, at 34, had not slowed. She had given up the outside bookkeeping work after Henry was born, when the ranch had achieved sufficient profitability to make it unnecessary. But the skills had found another application. She now helped two neighboring ranches manage their accounts at cost, and had developed a reputation in the Laramie business community as someone whose assessment of a financial situation was worth having. She was exactly herself, which had been the only ambition she had ever nursed, and the satisfaction of it was quiet and deep and entirely real. One evening in the autumn of 1891, they were sitting on the porch of the house after the children had gone to bed, which was the time of day they had always kept for themselves, the specific quiet hour of two people who had built something together reviewing the day and each other. And the sky over the Laramie range was doing something astonishing with the last of the sunset, all deep blue and burning copper, and Clark reached over and took Birdie's hand. She turned to look at him. After 8 years, she still saw him the way she had seen him at the station, with the full and specific attention that was her nature, and what she saw was a man who had come to himself, who had traveled the long way around and arrived somewhere real. "I think about that station sometimes," he said. "So do I," she said. "I had $1 left," he said. "Literally, that was what I had. And I gave it to you and rode away, and I did not have a plan, not one I believed in." "And then you turned back," she said. "You called me back," he said. "You had already decided to turn," she said. "I just gave you the sound of someone worth turning for." He looked at her in the last of the light. "I did not know what I was deciding," he said. "I thought I was just turning around. I did not know I was deciding everything." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was not a thing she did often. She was not by nature a leaner. It was something reserved for particular moments of particular trust, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the Wyoming evening with the sky burning out above them and the sound of the ranch settling around them and the knowledge, as solid as the land under their feet, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. "Clark," she said. "Yes. I think there might be a fourth," she said. He was still for a moment. Then he laughed genuinely, the full laugh that she had spent years accumulating from a man who had originally rationed his warmth carefully and now gave it freely. "Is that a certainty or a theory?" he asked. "A strong theory," she said. "I will be certain in a few more weeks." He tightened his arm around her. "Well," he said, "we will need to extend Owen's room." "Owen is 11, she said. "He can share with Henry for a while. He will complain about it and not mean it." "He will complain about it very eloquently," Clark said. "He comes by that honestly," she said. "From which of his parents?" "Both of them," she said, which was the truth, and they both knew it. And in the quiet Wyoming evening, with the last of the light going and the children asleep inside, and the whole of the life they had built together around them, they sat in the simplest and most complete kind of happiness, the kind that is made of real things, of honest work and genuine love and second chances honored with the full seriousness they deserve. The fourth child came in the spring of 1892, a girl, and they named her me, and there was nothing complicated about that decision at all. The Talbots became one of those families that a place builds its memory around, not the largest or the wealthiest, but one of the real ones, the ones that contributed something solid and lasting. Owen eventually took the ranch further than Clark and Birdie had, adding acreage in the good years and managing the lean ones with his mother's precision. Ruth Eleanor left Wyoming at 17 for a teaching college in Cheyenne, one of the first women in her family's circle to pursue formal education beyond the local school. And she came back 5 years later with a certificate and a career, and a husband of her own, a teacher named Patrick Flynn, who had the good sense to find her intelligence attractive rather than inconvenient. Henry stayed close to the land and to his father, working the ranch and eventually inheriting the northeast parcel when he was grown, and little me Talbot grew up with the name of a woman who had believed in second chances without making a production of it. And she demonstrated, in her own way and time, that she had inherited something of that quality. But before all of that, before the children were grown and the years had stacked into the satisfying architecture of a life well lived, there was just the two of them, sitting on a porch in Wyoming in the last of an autumn evening, with a ranch they had built from an honest dollar and a turning around, and the whole wide open country stretching out around them like a promise that had been kept. Clark Talbot had given Birdie Wells his last honest dollar at the station and ridden into a future he had not planned. He had planned in those months of running and suspension so many futures, futures of disappearance, futures of slow erosion, futures of men who had given up on themselves and were simply waiting for the consequences to catch up. Not one of those futures had looked like this. Not one of them had included the woman beside him, or the children inside, or the land that held them all, or the particular quality of a Wyoming evening understood as home rather than hiding place. He had not planned this future. He had somehow made it anyway. And it was, without question, without reservation, without a single thing left unresolved or unfinished, the best thing he had ever done.